Okay, thank you for coming back. I want to focus on rivers and dams. We did watersheds and climate yesterday morning, sedimentation engineering, probably the hardest, the most theoretical academic lecture of the four. Rivers and dams, a bit more practical here today. And this afternoon, talk about the river environment. And so I have 5 topics here. River equilibrium. I want to talk about equilibrium as opposed to stability and try to illustrate a bit of both there, but focus on river equilibrium. What is this? Then we'll talk a bit about aggradation cases. We have disequilibrium. So aggradation is one case, degradation, particularly below dams. And I'll follow this with 2 case studies, one in Korea and one in Brazil. So Gupo Bridge and Bountry. So the first topic here is on equilibrium, and I have 3 subparts there. I did not get too many sublabels and whatnot. And one is Manning's Inn or Manning Inn. I think there's something about the Rhine River in the Netherlands. That's where I did some study. I spent a sabbatical there, and it got a big flood in 1998. So in the lower part here, this part upstream of this Endurance Cup is called the Upper Rhine. It's called Boven Rhine, Upper Rhine. And then the lower part from there on is the Vaal River. And about 2/3 goes to the Vaal and 1/3 goes to the Penedence Canal. That is going to split up again. That's really a delta. And part of it goes to the IJsselmeer in the north of the Netherlands, and the other part with the old Rhine. I mean, it's kind of ironic. We have to say a few jokes, I guess. This is called the Upper Rhine. So for the Dutch, that's the upper part of the Rhine. And for the Germans, then in Germany, then of course it's farther upstream of this. They have the Upper Rhine is really with the Swiss border, and then you have the Middle Rhine, and the Lower Rhine is upstream of the Upper Rhine here in the Netherlands. So depending on which country you work in, you may have different nomination there. So the idea is that during those floods, they built a lot of berms and spur dikes all the way along for navigation and for ice control since the 17th century, they started working this river. Now it's regulated 260 meters wide, and they have navigation of barges going up and down this river. They have 2 barges going in one direction and one the opposite direction, and they get fogged there, in the fall and winter, and so they have to navigate this. And they put a lot of radio stations all along to help with navigation. And they are trying, I don't know if it's implemented now, but they were telling me they were developing this to get five lanes of barge traffic on the river, 3 in one direction, 2 in the opposite direction. So you can imagine how accurate things were. They got flooded. The Netherlands got major floods in the 50s, and after which the government invested tremendously into all the river work and river protection and levees, and also all the coastal protection work. They spent zillions of dollars. I don't know exactly how much. And they went from Nedico into the Delft Hydraulics. Delft Hydraulics had a huge lab there in the 90s, and 80s and 90s, and did a lot of studies. And they had at the time, in the 90s, some boats doing multispectral scanning of the riverbed, and they looked at bed forms and the changes over time. So I looked at this data during my sabbatical, and if you look at the dune height here on the left-hand side, the rising limb is the solid dots here, and the loose dots really is the falling limb. So you get hysteresis loop of the dune and the dune formation. So the dunes were growing. The discharge went up to about 9,000 cubic meters per second. So we're getting close to 350,000 CFS, a major flood there in that area. That was kind of interesting. That's the Boven Rhine. The upper part and the Vaal is on the right-hand side. It's a bit less of a tendency on the Vaal, but the Upper Rhine is, Boven means upper, so in Dutch. So I was looking at Manning's Inn here, and what you see, as the discharge increases, then your Manning's Inn went up from about to 5.035. And to me, that's something I did not understand at all, because I went to the school with Daryl Simons, and Daryl was always telling us, when you get the floods, the river plane out, Manning's Inn goes down, and then you increase the velocity, reduce the stage. So in terms of engineering design, this is always safe, because you're going to pick a 2-year flood or a 5-year flood. You're going to calibrate your model, and you're going to extrapolate for a 100-year flood to set up your levee height. And if the Manning's then decreases, it means that you overestimate resistance to flow. And in reality, when you get those extreme events or 100-year plus, then your stage will go down. So your levee design is going to be safe. So, but here you get the opposite. So calibrate your model at 5,000, and then eventually it's, well, 0.025, we use our model for this. And then as we all do, hydraulic engineers, so we assume 0.025, let this run here, let's run a 100-year flood on this thing. And you may get the surprise of your life to realize that, oh, wow, you underestimated the stage, and then you're going to bust your levees again. So this is the kind of point where knowing your river and making some measurements in situ in the river is really important. You cannot just rely on, say, oh, we'll calibrate this model for, the 2-year flood, and then blindly apply this to large floods. And it's sometimes very difficult to have data for those very large floods because you don't want to wait 50 years before you build up a database that will allow you to understand what we're talking about. Okay, my second subtopic is the downstream hydraulic geometry. The downstream hydraulic geometry is going to compare rivers at baneful condition. So we're looking at small stream versus large streams. We're not looking at stage discharge relationship, but we're looking at the small river on the left-hand side in the mountain somewhere, and a large river on the right-hand side there. So we compare, let's say, the South Platte with the Missouri River, or the Missouri with the Mississippi, and so forth. So we have different locations, and therefore downstream hydraulic geometry. The terms were studied at Luna Leopold in the 50s and whatnot. The width of the channel at baneful discharge, the depth, which is the cross-section area divided by the top width, is the average flow depth, and then the mean flow velocity, the discharge divided by area with depth, and then the slope of the channel. So I tried at the time to compare different characteristics of rivers from, small streams to large rivers, and really studied it. So baneful is important. Just also, like yesterday, you saw that when you exceed baneful, you're going to stall your flood waves tremendously. So once the water gets onto the floodplain, then you're going to get little flow on the floodplain, and you're going to get some sedimentation, but you're going to stall the flood, and the water will pass through more or less at the discharge slightly higher than the baneful discharge, and for quite some time until the water from the floodplain either comes back, returns to your main channel, or infiltrates into the banks. Does it make sense? So therefore, it is a discharge that is quite significant for alluvial streams to understand the morphology and also the flood control that you can get in those watersheds. So when I was a postdoc here with Daryl Simons, that's in the 80s, and I said, well, that's interesting. There were some methods here to say width, depth, velocity, and slope should be a function of Q and DS at the time. So discharge and grain size, median grain size. Colin Thorne, among others, then they studied Keller Halls and Dale Bray in Canada. They studied gravel bed rivers, and they tried to get those main parameters, the flow depth, H, the channel width, W, the top width, and then the velocity, mean flow velocity, and the slope as power function of discharge and grain size. And those were empirical relationships at the time in the 80s. A lot of gravel bed river conferences, and one of them at CSU, and Colin Thorne edited some of those big gravel bed river symposia and whatnot. But I looked at this thing, I thought, that's really interesting. Some people were saying, yes, but we can get the same thing, considering that Q is AV, meaning width depth is a cross-section area, times the velocity is my discharge, right? So, and combine this with the resistance to flow equation and a sediment transport equation. So they developed some models to get this and try to solve that. And others at the time in the 80s, they really loved the minimum stream power, and there was a big fashion with minimum stream power, so maximum resistance to flow and all kinds of things, all minimal, extreme, minimal hypotheses in a way. And I said, well, there must be a way to put this together analytically. So I combined 3 parameters, actually 4, that reduced to 3. One is the velocity times the width times the depth, the cross-section area, is the discharge. So this is 1. I use the resistance to flow equation. Instead of sediment, I use the Shields parameter that we talked about yesterday. You see that, and that's my tau star. The Shields parameter, that's going to be a descriptor. If tau star is very low, 0.047 or 0.03, everything will stop. I'll get a stable channel, meaning nothing moves off the banks of the river. And if it's high, I will get some sediment transport. Does that make sense? And the fourth one was the condition of secondary flows. So we get tangent lambda, really get secondary flows in rivers, which is function of the ratio of the flow depth to the grain size. So I combined those four. And those analytical development just horrendous. It just took me the whole weekend really to try to untie this thing. And the formula was very big and whatnot. But I realized, through applications later on that the effects of secondary flow was very minimal, does not change the parameters very much, okay? Because it's more or less the same thing for all rivers. So this one became more or less a constant. And then I had only three parameters left. So meaning discharge, grain size, and tau star. And I look at this thing and then I say, well, I can simplify resistance to flow with Manning's N, which is the most common one for decent rivers, unless you have very steep cobble bed streams or boulder bed streams like we have some places here in Colorado. And so for most rivers, if M is 1/6 and you get a simple system like this, a power function of discharge, grain size, and in some cases, tau star, the sediment transport. Now, for some people I know, especially when I teach, then they say, oh yeah, that's all mathematics and when that, it means nothing. And I tell students all the time, mathematics is not just mathematics. Try to understand physically what's going on and try to learn something from the mathematics, what that expression is giving you. I'll give you an example here on how you can think about this, okay? Look at the influence of discharge. Which exponent of discharge will be high? Well, first the width. So if I increase my discharge, I will increase the width of the river. Power 0.5 was pretty much what Leopold and Woolman were describing a long time ago in the 50s, if I remember. So then, 0.5 is if you increase the discharge from a small stream to a big river, then the width is going to change first. Which second parameter will change most? Well, the flow depth, 0.4 and 0.53, that's 0.93. It explains most, the greatest part of the variability in the effect of the discharge. See, velocity 0.07, that's very small. And here, minus 0.4, that's a different thing. So we'll talk about this here, right? So if you have a large discharge, dominant discharge, we call this dominant or bankful discharge, really, you need a big cross-section area. So the cross-section area of a river at bankful is a great indicator of the dominant discharge. So this is for the water. And I tried to do the same reasoning with the sediment. With the sediment, now, which parameter is going to be affected the most? Well, look at the slope. 1.2. Look at the velocity, 0.47. Now you start to see what's going to happen. You have the water and the sediment. Does it make sense? Yeah. So the water is the cross-section area, the width and the depth. And the sediment is going to be primarily on the slope and the velocity. Those are the two main parameters being affected by the sediment transport. So this is one of the things that I learned from this, okay? Another thing that you will see, you have Q to the minus 0.4. If I multiply both sides by Q to the plus 0.4, then Q to the 0.4 times S is proportional to ds times tau star to the 1.2. Tau star is a measure of the sediment load. So what did you find here? The relationship here developed at the Bureau of Reclamation, that is Q times S proportional to QS times ds. That's the Lane relationship, isn't it? Yeah, the Lane relationship that we use. Lane used kind of conceptual and said, well, if we do this, then here's what's going to happen, and it kind of fiddle and played with this and whatnot. But analytically, you can understand the mechanics behind those things here. And that's what I try to explain. I tried to publish this for a long time, and people say, I just theory, don't care about this. We don't want to publish this in Journal of ASC or whatnot. So I got one student from Indonesia called Jaya Murni Warga Dalam. Okay, that's why we'll call this the JW equations, kind of a simplified version of it. So we tested this, and I tested him and said, well, find me a data set. So each point of this graph is one different river. So one river. So we got a database. At first, we had like 800 rivers, and then we added some more later on. At the last I did, there was a professor from Korea who came as visiting and whatnot, and he extended this. We got like 1,400 different rivers around the world, with at baneful condition, as close to baneful as it could be. So if you look at the width, so you get prediction and measured here, right? So from 1 meter, tiny, trickle or creek, all the way up to 2 kilometers wide. So pretty large rivers. You get a bend. Factor 2 is typically what I say. 95% of the points are typically within factor 2, meaning you predict 100 meters, so okay, it's between 50 and 200. So method's not all that accurate. And also rivers, you measure the width of a river. Some place it's narrow, some place it's wide, right? So which one is bankful and whatnot? So you get variability on the measurements and the theory. So, but the point is that varies by 1 to 3 orders of magnitude. Flow depth may have 10 centimeter. Yeah, it's a tiny, call this a river, I don't know. 10 meters, typically. So it changed by 2 orders of magnitude or so. Now, the other thing we see from this is the velocity. And velocity, you ask me, what's the velocity at Bankful for a river? I said 1 meter per second. Yeah, I like those benchmarks. I talked about this yesterday. 1 millimeter, 1 Pascal, a watershed, 1,000 tons per square kilometer per year. So 1 meter per second is my target number. If you get a lot of sediment transport, we found a minute ago that if there's a lot of transport, then your velocity for the dominant discharge, rainfall, will be a bit higher. So typically, if you increase sediment load, you'll go 2, 3, maybe 4, right? And if you get a lot less, then you get less. So correlation is not super great, but because the variability is between, I would say, 0.5 to 2 or 3 meters per second, right? So last one, the slope, and I think that's where the JW method is better than many others. I count rivers now in centimeters per kilometer, because it's 10 minus 5, okay? So the Mississippi will be 3 to 4 centimeter per kilometer, the order of magnitude. And the Poudre or the Big Thompson, typically 10% or 0.1. So you go from 10 minus 5 or around here to, 10% slope is really not quite a river anymore. 10% slope is really coming down, right? So you get still 1, 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude. So that's where you get a lot of variability. Sediment transport, we said, changes the slope and changes the velocity. So this is like for really the effects of sediment transport. So that's how I distribute things. I talk about equilibrium. The sense for equilibrium is what comes in goes out. Does it make sense? Stability is a different thing. Stability, the rocks on the bank do not move. There's no motion. And I know some people, I used to have a colleague, Chester Watson, he was teaching fluvial geomorphology, and the notation was just the opposite. So I said, I need to clarify this thing. Stability, you design riprap to be stable, so it will not go. You design this for a 100-year flood, your rocks are going to be there. They're stable, they're not going to move. But equilibrium is a different concept in my view, and I'll explain this with a good example that you'll relate to. So whatever sediment comes in and water will come out at the other end. There could be changes in between. Does that make sense? But what comes in will go out. One good example I use in teaching is the beach. You go to a beach and you get a wave coming in the beach. Each wave is going to take some sand, is going to move it up the beach, and then it comes down the beach. So, and then the next wave comes, the sand goes up. So the sand particle is not stable. Does it make sense? But you get equilibrium in the sense of, the sun goes up, the sun goes down. And you go there tomorrow, the beach will be there. It will be very similar to what it was today and yesterday and so forth, right? So this is in equilibrium. Does it make sense? Yeah. So in that sense, I view that meandering rivers are, or can be, in equilibrium. So you get equilibrium, meaning the sand is going to come in and go out. So you could have a lateral migration of your river and whatnot, but the river is going to be in equilibrium because what comes in upstream and maybe 1 mile downstream is going to get through. So here a bit of analytical work, and I'll skip the equations because I know you love them so much. We did experiments. Actually, Shigeru Kawai, a Japanese fellow, he came, did a sabbatical with us, and he was doing experiments on very, very sharp flume there. And he had sands, different colors, black and white, and which a good idea. I did something similar later on at CSU in the lab there. So I used coarse sand and fine sand. So coarse sand over there and fine sand here. And he said, I don't understand this. And it puzzled me for quite some time too. He said, I get the sand to deposit some places where the black will keep going. That's impossible. Use the Shields diagram. You say, well, my sand should be stable, so my coarse sand should deposit, and the fine will move, right? And then after that, if I reduce the shear some more, then the fine will settle on top of it. No, you can get both at the same time. And this is puzzling. And then we start playing with the equation based on coefficient of moment and not just shear forces like the Shields parameter I talked about yesterday. I said incipient motion is really a ratio of moments and not ratio of forces. Make sense? Yeah. So therefore, if you start playing with those equations, you'll find a zone for the fine sand where you get sedimentation or you get erosion here. You can get sedimentation a wider range here of values for that. Lambda is the secondary flow angle compared to the coarse sand out there. So therefore, you can have deposition in areas where the coarse sand will be under erosion. I mean, that's kind of fascinating, right? But really, the proof is somewhat in the pudding because that's how we started. We get observations where the fine sand would deposit on the point bar, and on the talweg, of course, you would find the coarse sand there. The fine would not deposit there. So, I mean, that's in the 90s that he came. And around 2000, maybe a bit before that, Deb Anthony and Mike Harvey, who worked at CSU there in the fluvial geomorphology department and whatnot. So Deb Anthony worked with him in the Rocky Mountain National Park. So I did a project there and look in the horseshoe band here in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and very sharp bands. If you enter you go to Estes Park, you enter the Fall River Road, and then you go to kind of a big flat plain there, and there's a meandering channel going all around. So we picked two bands, not me, but she did all the study there. So what she did, she looked at the river, after the Long Lake failure, dam failure in the, 83, 84 or so, and that brought a pulse of sand and so forth. So we're interested in looking at sediment transport in those bands. What she found was kind of interesting. She did all the field survey. So she did the heli Smith there. Every stream is about 10 meters wide. So every meter, she had a heli Smith in collecting sediment data. She would take the data, get this in particle size distribution for each size class. Then she would get how much is passing through. And then she would say, okay, I'll look at each of my 10 sections there. And for the 8 millimeter particle, the D95 there, and 0.25. And she did also all the others in between. So 0.25 to all the way to 8 millimeter gravel, so a mixture of gravel and sand. Did a 0.25, 0.5, and so forth. 1, 2, and 4, and 8 millimeters. So, and then if you do a scan over a cross section, how much sediment is being passing? So the first one, a certain number, second one, second number, you divide by the total you have over a cross section. Does it make sense? So that's what those little charts are. So the coarse grains, right, the 8 millimeter, you see that here they are mostly on the right-hand side there. Does it make sense? Yeah. And then you can see how those changes occur in those very sharp bends. Does it make sense? Yeah. So she did the same thing here for the fine sediment. Well, the fine sediment was coming more in the middle or the other side and kind of crossing over onto the point bar, and it would stick to the point bar and then come here, and then it would cross over to the other side. You see that? So the fine sediment, due to secondary flow, would really go over to the point bar. Dr. Ettema was right yesterday talking, if you put your intake right here, what's going to happen? You're going to get a sedimentation problem, right? Yeah, sure, the sediment is going to come to you. That makes sense? The fine one. The coarse one is going to go to the outside. It goes to the talweg. The talweg is the deeper sections on the the outside of the bin. So see the coarse fractions here, 8 millimeter goes to the talweg and comes in here and will go to the talweg every time. The fine sediment is going to do the opposite, right? It will go to the point bar. The fines go to the point bar and comes here, will go to the point bar. So you get secondary flows coming and sorting out those particles. Many models, they'll use an angle for the transport of solids with the same for all particle sizes. And to me, this is incorrect because of our observations. After this, and I don't have another slide, but Kristen Bountry did a lot of fluvial geomorphology investigations in gravel and cobble bed streams. She didn't like the Hellesmith so much. She says it sucks in the sense that because of the flare angle of the Hellesmith, then you get the suction that's coming in, and that overestimates the sediment transport of fines at very low flow. So she developed her own sediment traps, which do not have a big flare angle, and they have a long bag in the back to collect all the sediment. And she found more or less the same thing here in numerous creeks, the St. Louis Creek and many others, Little Granite Creek here in the Rocky Mountains. So different particle size can move different directions. Later on, or around the same time, we work a bit with some numerical models. And you may know Jennifer Duan. She's at University of Arizona now. She must be fully established, full professor, I would think, by now. She was at Desert Research Institute for a number of years, and she went to the school at Ole Miss with Sami Wang, a Chinese, who developed tremendous models out there. And Jennifer was one of the best programmers, and she took the model and then went to Desert Research Institute and eventually became faculty at University of Arizona. And she developed a model there. And we look at Friedkin's experiments, 1945, at the Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg. And she tried to replicate this. So starting with just one pulse in a straight channel there, one little bend wave there, and see how does this change over time. And you can see her model after 1 hour, 2 hours. I mean, it's kind of clock time, but you see eventually things change and go very fast. And eventually things start to slow down, right? So the change of lateral, when you start, getting left and right, you reduce the slope. Then you have, reduced velocity. So the ability to scour out the outer bends decreases, right? So, and I looked at the third one here and I said, wow, I mean, this is quite amazing. I remembered that years before that, when I met Drew Beard on the bus story that he told us yesterday morning, where the bus got stranded there, we visited the field trip on the Rio Perco. And that's an old picture here. Drew, you may remember this, the Perco, isn't it? So on top here, what happened is that I think it's Federal Highway Administration, that they had a problem with the river encroaching into the roadway all the time. So they relocated all the way to bedrock in a straight canal that would go with the step. There was a step about 10 feet, as I remember, and the river goes straight out. And this had been done, I don't know exactly how many years, but 8 years or 10 years prior to my visit there in 86. I took that picture there and I said, well, look, it's going right and left and right and left, and then eventually it goes back to straight. I said, let me look at this thing on Google, and you see, hey, wow. So look at the model going down and up and down and up and down, and now it's wow. I said, that cannot be true, And so I like Jennifer. She's a great modeler, and sometimes the models come in waves. I remember Reclamation at G-Stars here for a generation or so, and that was the bread and butter of everything. And it changed. I don't think anybody talks since Victor and Young have been here. I think you really develop a new generation of models, a lot more powerful and so forth. So the modelers are very important. So you don't want to lose Victor and Young here, because you may have all the best model in the world, but if you don't have the guy to run this behind you, I think you're in trouble. I want to show you with this simulation here from Jennifer that, we had the couple loops there. Now, what I want to illustrate with this You see, it took for 1.5 hours to get to that point from the Friedkin experiment. And now after that, it takes a longer time to get to the long sinuous thing, the valsing, and then you have to wait twice as long to get the highly sinuous. I know Gary Parker calls this the Kinoshita model and whatnot. So where it's not, you get the sine generated curves for a while, and eventually it deforms a kind of double frequency coming through this. And Gary calls this the Kinoshita, according to a Japanese fellow there and so forth. So here, you see, we have a lot of erosion on the outside, filling of the point bar with fine sand. You see also the ancient point bars that were here and get vegetated over time. So you can do aerial photography at different times, and you can look at dendrochronology and look at, well, this may be 5 to 7 years of age, and this may be 12 to 15 or things like that, right? So there's an art to find a lot more about those rivers and how they shift and how they change over time. So this is important. But my point here, this river is still in equilibrium. This is a red river. I don't know. I think you get Texas on one side and Arkansas on the other. So it is a nice meandering. But if you go a long distance like this, then your velocity will go down. Your sediment transport will go down. That is the point. The river will find a new equilibrium with a lower sediment load. Yeah. So the river will try to adjust its sediment load to its planeform geometry. The maximum capacity will be narrow and straight channel all the way down, right? You reduce the sediment load, so the river will start to take the longer route to reduce the velocity and reduce in sediment transport capacity. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's the way I see those effects of meandering. Aggradation. So I think I made the point clear with equilibrium. Even I consider a meandering channel in equilibrium with the lower sediment load, right? So, all right, so aggradation. So what's going to happen? The lane relationship, this relationship here was developed by Emery Lane. Conceptual age is the product of two. You have the water and slope, the discharge and slope, and you have the sediment on the other side, the grain size and the sediment load conceptually. It says Whitborland, we did the scale. We did a paper in the essay in which we talk about Whitborland and his life and so forth. Lane came up with the equation or the relationship, because it's not quite an equation. Whitborland came up with the idea of the scale. So I like to call it Borland scale, but should be probably Lane-Borland scale. So now the point is that if you overload, right, so you get more sediment, you increase the amount of sediment here, right? So what's going to happen? You're going to tip the scale, and that needle is going to go in the aggradation range here. Suppose that you start in a meandering river. What is going to happen? How does the river increase its slope? It's meandering. It wants to scour the outside of the bend, right? So, well, what it's going to do, those areas where you have the talweg on the outside there will silt up, will fill up. And now you raise the bed a little bit. So the water wants to cut off straight through. We call them chute cutoffs. You see, you have 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, you see that? It's kind of cool, isn't it? So chute cutoff to me is a result of a river that wants to start to increase its sediment load. Or maybe you get just one big flood that comes in, fills in the pockets, fills the holes there, and eventually tries to find a shortcut. And we get some fresh sediment on the floodplain here. Well, let's cut through this thing. We'll get a straight line here, right? Instead of going around it. Doesn't make so that's a way for the river saying, well, my bed is coming up, so I'm being pushed up a little bit. And if I can find a little shortcut here on the soft part on the point bar, I'm going to take it. If you increase it some more, here's another river here. The river used to meander, right? Go all the way around, right? And go there and go all the way around and come back here. Now you increase sediment load in this thing. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to fill some areas. You raise the river bed up, and down. The water has to go somewhere, right? It goes on the floodplain, and it'll try to go straight. Or there's a right straight to the floodplain. I'm going to go cut straight through, right? So this was here your your plane, the river will try to cut through. It tried to cut across right there. You increase sediment load in this river, you fill this up here, the river will go cut through this thing here. It will go to the other one behind it. Does it make sense? It will try to straighten its course. So that's how you go from a meandering channel back to a straight channel. So another process sometimes when you have long meander loops, you get oxbow lakes formed from a neck cutoff. You get a neck cutoff and you get fluvial geomorphologists here. I'm sure they can explain a lot about this thing, but you're going to get sediment clogging this part here, vegetation start to grow, and you get a nice area, a little pond for aquatic habitat for ducks and geese and catfish. And now your river, instead of going all the way around, now you have a short distance for a drop of maybe 6 inches or whatever. Now the river will rejuvenate. You see the velocity is increased already in this thing, right? So how a river can self-correct itself or adjust itself for an increase in sediment load. If you keep increasing this, right? So now the river carries the sediments like the juggler with too many balls. I have too many balls. I cannot do this. So they fall off on the ground, right? They fall on the bed of the river, right? So what's going to happen? Your riverbed goes up and goes up. We said for a given discharge, you need a certain cross-section area. Well, if you fill this up, what do you do to your river? You force it out of banks. Does it make sense? You force it to go onto the floodplain. And it's going to start scouring a bit left and right. And it's going to form a channel that is wide and shallow. Does it make sense? Yeah. Because this river is not in equilibrium, in my view, right? You get net aggradation. You get more sediment feeding into the system than what it can carry at the downstream end. So the sediment is going to fall. And 1 year it's going to fall here and fill this up and fill this up. This goes up a little bit. Oh, no, this is lower now. It's going to come here. So 1 year it's here, 1 year it's there. Like Rob explained yesterday, it's very hard to get an intake somewhere on rivers like this because they can be here today and gone tomorrow, right? And all of a sudden you end up with all the sediment that you have to clean up. I want to talk about channel width variability because within one river, you can have converging flow or diverging flow. What does this mean, okay? Rob had a nice slide yesterday explaining with the river intakes that converging channels, the flow's coming down, right? So converging flow is good because you scour the bed, and you can have an intake right here, you get more or less clear water. Make sense? Yeah, you get deeper channel. Why is that? Because of the trap efficiency. The trap efficiency increases with the width of the space that you have. If you design settling ponds, you want to have a large surface area. So for a given length of a channel, if it's very wide, you're going to trap more sediment. Just the trap efficiency, the design of stilling basins, settling basins. Does it make sense? Yeah. So converging flow, because if you increase the unit discharge, you increase the concentration. If you increase the concentration, you'll pass more sediment coming out than what's coming in. You don't have equilibrium, you'll have a net scour. Well, the opposite is true here. If you get diverging flow, what's going to happen? You have sediment, but it's not deep enough. You don't have enough stress to carry all those sediment. Those balls are there, but you cannot carry this, so they fall on the ground. Divergence means, in general, aggradation, and convergence, degradation, right? Degradation, the bed goes down. Aggradation, the bed goes up. So here's an example. Large rivers are prone to that a lot. So the Mississippi, Missouri, and so forth. So some example, we have a couple examples here. So the river has been widening. So what's happening? Wow, you get sedimentation all over the place. The river starts to converge. What's happening? You get clear water here. It starts to scour this all out. This is from Phil Combs, who has retired now from the Corps of Engineers. Chucked up bar in the Mississippi River. I mean, you guys are fortunate to work on the Rio Grande because it's not too big, not too small. You can see real rivers. You have sedimentation, you have a lack of sediment, and so forth. You have everything in a small system. The Mississippi is a huge system, and it's very hard to have effective countermeasures without spending millions and billions of dollars. Here, 1972, you see the widening? It's flowing up and to the right. Yes. So the river was widening. You see Choctaw Bar. So the river tried to cut through, shoot cut off, thank you. Tried to cut through there and go there. Over here, you get converging flow. So you see, you get scour at this end, but in between, you get a lot of sedimentation. And the sedimentation, first year, 72 cost them $500,000. And within 3 years, they had to spend $2 million of maintenance. Dredging is expensive. It used to be about $1 a cubic yard. And so that's a lot of money that you spend, $2 million a year. So what did the Corps do? Here, you can build levees, right? Now, here's the main thing about levees. So if you have a given height, you have a given area, right? If I double the height, I will square, 2 times 2, I have 4 times this area. Does it make sense? Yeah. So it means if I double the height, I get 4 times the volume of material that I need. So it means that if it is very deep, then I need huge volume of material. But if I go shallow, I can do longer distance. Make sense? Yeah. So meaning the length of the dike is inversely proportional to the flow depth that you have, right? So for instance, if it's 3 times as deep, then you get 3 times 9 times. You could build a dike in shallow water 9 times as long, yeah, as you would do at 3 times the depth, because of the same amount of material, and material controls the cost really primarily. So you want to build your levees where it is shallow, right? So the idea of what they did, you see, you had the big openings before, so they start closing this here in the shallow areas, the lighter colored here, 10 to 20, minus 10, minus 20. So they start to fill this up, and they left just a little opening for environmental purpose for that, for this area here. And after they controlled this thing, the rivers started coming around, and it cut naturally through that bar, the sandbar you add up there. So instead of dredging this yourself, let the river do it. Now you see, you have a nice channel. The width is pretty much controlled all along. It's very good for navigation. A long radius of curvature, which is very good for navigation of barges. You reduce the strength of the secondary flows, because the barge is always forced, like the ice always forced to the outside of the bend. So if you navigate this thing, you have to get a crab angle to come here to push really towards the point bar all the time, right? So you want to get a certain width for doing this. You can save a lot of money. Here's another one, Cottage Bend in 76, same idea. You see, widening means sedimentation. Converging flow means you're going to get some scour. So what did they do? You build a dike where it is shallow, because you can build a much longer dike in shallow areas than building something in the deep like here. Make sense? Yeah. So they build a long dike here because this was shallow in the yellow area right there, right? So you want to control the width here that will let the opening to let this pass through. You'll get sedimentation here, and the river is going to naturally cut through this thing here. In 95, I took a picture, but you can see even, 10 years later, so you still have a nice channel. I should invert this thing around, but anyway, I need to rework my slides, so that's a different issue. You get the idea, huh? Converging flow, diverging flow, and the implication for navigation, for dredging. Dredging is expensive. With slope trade-offs, I explained the equilibrium value from downstream hydraulic geometry of a river, and now I want to talk about the Rio Grande. And thanks to DRO and Reclamation, I've been fortunate to work on this river since 93, 92, around that. DRO has been involved in pretty much all of this. Nathan Holstey has been involved also in the past 10, 15 years. Nate Bradley also is a reviewer of current work on that beautiful river. And I want to talk about some of the work that was done in the Bosque area. So I could have talked about sediment plug, but anyway, I decided not to do so. But I want to illustrate the very important concept. The river will carry, that's the sediment transport capacity of the river as function of channel width. So we fix the discharge, the grain size, the slope, Manning's End, G, and so forth. There are two sets of curves. I should redo this with just one discharge, but anyway, to explain the concept. But you have the one below is at 3,000 CFS, the X is in red, and at 5,000 CFS is the green and blue on top there. Here's the key point. For many years, people believed that minimum stream power was determining the width of a river. So according to this, you should have maximum sediment transport. And where you have this 130 feet, this is where all rivers should be. And from my experience and probably some others, we figured out all rivers are much wider than what you get from minimum extremal hypotheses. And why is that? Well, because the banks are a little weaker than those models predict. Those models predict the banks just as rigid as the bed and whatnot. So, and this is just not the case. But the key is that past the maximum transport capacity that you have is that the transport capacity, as you make the river wider than it should be, then it is going to carry less sediment. For a given discharge, Manning end, slope, and grain size, then the wider the river is going to be, because it's shallower, it can carry less sediment. Does it make sense? Yeah. So it's the same idea as the converging flow and the diverging flow that we just talked about a minute ago. So if you think about it, you can tie those two things together and understand. People will tell me, well, yes, but there's not that much difference. Well, if you look at this, you get 100,000 tons per day at 3,000 CFS, okay? Here you get 100,000, and at the maximum you get 150,000 tons per day. It's not that much, isn't it? But a difference of 50,000 tons a day means a lot of shoveling and a lot of dredging and a lot of accumulation of sediment. 50,000 tons of sediment in one day can really fill your channel pretty quickly. So a narrower river is going to be more effective to carry sediment than a wider river. So we did test this idea that we get a width and slope trade-off. And it's very hard to do in real rivers. And I was delighted to see Rob's slide yesterday with his long contraction scour, which I pointed out. I said, well, look at the slope in the narrow section, which was a quarter 2 foot wide compared in a 8 foot wide channel. So the factor 4 here over that length there, about, I forgot, 25, 30 feet. The slope was less than it was way upstream, right? And this is what we found here, right? So what we explain here is that the river goes from about 50 meters in width to 300 meters in width because of vegetation clearance and maintenance that Bureau has done. And then it goes down to less than 50, about 30, 40 meters of width, and it goes up a little bit, and whatnot, depending on time and so forth. Well, the idea, the river will try to pass the water and the sediment through, yeah? So if you get 50,000 tons a day of difference, the adjustments can take place fairly quickly over time, right? So the hypothesis that we had is that, well, if it's wide, you cannot carry the sediment. So what's going to happen? You're going to pile up some sediment there, well, until you increase the slope, until you can pass the sediment through. Does that make sense? Yeah. And if it's narrow upstream, then you can have a flat slope that carries the sediment. You widen this thing, now the slope will increase, and then you narrow this again, the slope will decrease. And we get enough evidence because the Bureau has collected data on the AgDeg from 62, 72, 92, 2002, 2012. Every 10 years, you get some good data set every 500 feet. Then we could really compare that and see the wider reach of the steeper slope than the narrower reaches. And that is important. I call this width depth trade-offs because the JW would give you, for a given discharge grain size and tau star, you get one width. Degradation, the opposite. So where the rivers are being starved with sediment. Well, I will not spend too much time on this thing. I think Dr. Ettema really covered this thing here. You see, bridge piers and piles, and now when you get woody debris coming in between there, you look for trouble. Stability, that's the slide I use for stability. And again, Dr. Ettema covered this. I'll go real quickly. You design riprap to make sure this will not move, period. right? So you don't want to say it moves here and there, but what comes in goes out. If you get degradation, you're going to get incision, and you're going to get head cutting that propagates up your channel network, up your watershed. You want to prevent this from happening. So a lot of people have been developing drop structures, and you get a rock ramp, something like this here. This guy is about 2 meters. He's a tall guy, about 2 meters high. It gives you an idea of the size of riprap that they placed here, and that's in Colorado. And they grouted all this riprap and whatnot. It works well enough. There's, at this time, sedimentation on top of it. In some cases, then consultants push their luck a little bit. They try to develop very high drop structures like this, which I do not like and I do not recommend to anyone. The reason is that you're going to get water in the ground. And the water, typically those people will grout the riprap here because they don't want to put all the gravel filters and everything underneath. And they grout this thing, and the groundwater level is at level of the water upstream. And the water it will try to go around your structure. If you have a big drop in elevation over a short distance, it's going to scallop on one side or the other, and it's going to undermine your grouted riprap, flake it and break it down, and then you're going to get a major problem. And the risk of failure of those structures is relatively high. Here's an example. I go quickly again because Dr. Ettema illustrated this process so well. The idea on the upper left, and you get a flood passing through, you get a kind of a slab there underneath the bridge, you get wing walls, and then you get a sheet pile. And the sheet pile was too thin, got bent over, and then the water started undercutting this thing. And then you see here to the right, then the water is still flowing through, the wing wall fell down. And then down here, you can see how much after the flood, that thing is like a piece of cracker. There's no rebar reinforcement. You get about 2 meters of scour underneath there. And thank God, I mean, this flood stopped. So you see the bridge is still standing, but you could have problems where you start getting into problems with your road. You don't want to drive there at 2 o'clock in the morning or, 11 at night and see a big hole like this in the roadway. Here's another example from Colorado, and of course, I cannot disclose too much there. In technical terms here, this one is absolutely baffling me. Look at all the piles, those concrete piles that have been put in here, and you put protection below the bridge, as Dr. Ettema explained there, because you get head cutting and so forth. You want to get your protection below the bridge to protect the bridge pier that are just upstream and keep the sediment level at the level of the footings. So you said the footings should be buried a little bit. So you want to set that level for your analysis. You can see there's a concrete cutoff wall, kind of double. There's another row of piles just tied together. So another essentially cutoff wall that has been sandwiched between 2 layers of sheet piles. So you can see the one upstream is still holding, the one downstream is not. And I've shown another picture a minute ago where the sheet piles are bending over. People try to save money on sheet piles. I think it's okay on the upstream, but not on the downstream side. If you want to use sheet piles because they are cheaper than your concrete cutoff walls, then put the thick sheet piles at the downstream end, because you're going to get degradation here. Your sheet piles become in cantilevered position. You're going to get soil and water and ice on the upstream end that's going to, break through it. And as soon as you get a hole between your sheet piles, then you start getting into trouble. You get the regressive erosion cutting through your structure. Okay, so we're looking now where I'm going to reduce the sediment load here. I'm going to starve it a little bit. So now the scale is going to go in the opposite direction. The arrow will come in the direction of degradation. The Rio Grande Cochiti Dam was built in 73, 74, and then, impact started below in 75 or so. You can see the Bureau's aerial photographs of 1918, 35, 49, 52, 62, 72, 92, and so forth, right? So you can see there are multiple channels. Yeah, a lot of sediment there all over the place, very wide. And 72 start to get still wide, start to get more single thread channel. 92, have 20 years more or less after the construction of the dam, the Cochiti Reach, the upper reach, then it starts to meander a little bit. So here's some GIS pictures in 1918, so the Cochiti Reach, And then 1935, you get lateral shifting very quickly. In 1949, get a little narrower in light blue, then the dark purple in 62, and then you get 72. You see the river's getting narrower. And then 85, and the last one, you see 85 start to meander. So in 92, meanders the light yellow, the rivers start to go left and right here, right? So you went from braiding to meandering. Very wonderful case study here for the Rio Grande. How does this happen? How does the river get, you live with white pants, how do you get narrow again, right? So, I mean, it's just how do you lose weight, so to speak, right? So, well, through degradation, you scour this all out. So what's going to happen? You reduce the water level. As the water level used to be painful, now it comes down here. Oh, now you get a narrow and deep channel. Does that make sense? It's through incision. Incision is the process that is leading the river to become narrow. So this is the active channel width. The river used to be about 300 meters wide, 1,000 feet wide, and it went down to about 70, 80 meters, depending on where, different locations here, very systematically throughout the river. With Gilles Richard, we look at a model. We have an equilibrium width, right, so GW, whatever, and then our river is really wide, so it wants to go towards equilibrium. So we hypothesize that the change is proportional to the difference, where it is and where it wants to be. So if there's a big difference, then it will adjust quickly. And if it's very close, then it will take some time to adjust. Make sense? Yeah. So we assume that the change, and this is data on the Rio Grande again, that is the change in width, negative because it's reducing width, is proportional to the active channel width. And you can see with the data at different locations, it points to a point where you get zero. If you get zero, then that's where you reach equilibrium. That's where the river wants to be. Does it make sense? So if you take this model and you write this in differential form, you get a formula where the width should be in equilibrium plus the difference times the decreasing exponential. So that's a very simple model. Gigi went to MIT, so for a master's, did PhD with us, funded by Reclamation. And so we applied this there. So different reaches, the Rio Grande. The model works very well. You can see equilibrium is something that does not exist. The river goes towards equilibrium, but it will take 90, 15, 35, 20 years. It's halfway there, or just about. It takes 25 years to be halfway there. It's like radioactive decay that, it takes a long time to adjust. This river is very active, carries a lot of sediment, right? And even if you starve it completely, it takes time to adjust. This is comparison with JW. So in 1918, the river was really wide compared to what JW would give you. And over time, so 1918 and then 35 and whatnot. So in 92, we were a lot closer to equilibrium, around 80 meters, something like that. Estuaries. Here's an example with degradation. People try to extract sand and gravel, and that's in Malaysia. So people say, well, the government issues some permits, so you can dredge there and you can extract the sand. We'll use the sand for construction. So that's a great idea. So then they issue some permits, get a bit of money from those companies to extract the sand. They use sand for construction. And that's a great idea, for the government. You make money and it solves your flooding problem. Yes. But here's the big flood on the Muda River. This is the coastal level here, 0. And then big flood, passing through this thing. But because of the gravel mining, then you scour the bed. The bed used to be, maybe you see that dot there all the way straight down here. So you excavate a lot of material out of the bed. And what happens that you can imagine when the flood is gone, discharge goes close to 0. The water surface is going to drop very close to where the red line is going to be, right? Does it make sense? Yeah. So what's going to happen? Well, the highlands there, where for irrigation, you used to have the water flow naturally by gravity to the irrigation fields. And now you cannot do this anymore, right? So now you have to pump the water from the river that's a lot lower now, so into the irrigation field. Problem number one, the government has to pay for that. Yeah, but it's a different branch of the government, right? So it's irrigation and drainage. Now, at low flow, when it goes down to zero and you get a high tide here, what's going to happen? You get salt water coming into this thing here. Does it make sense? Yeah. And this can go 30 kilometers inland. Yeah. So now all of a sudden you start pumping salt water into your farmlands, right? So now you get another problem. So what are you going to do? You need to build a delta barrage here, right, to prevent the salt water from intruding into your river.